Benvenuti e bentornati nel saluto virtuale della MuA Sinnai, Museo e Archivio. Siamo qui oggi per un nuovo appuntamento con i talk, dialoghi di arte, archeologia e architettura. Oggi è un giorno particolarmente importante ed è collegato a un evento della settimana scorsa. Sabato scorso infatti abbiamo inaugurato la mostra che abbiamo nominato Katachi, la forma delle cose, e che mette a dialogo una delle opere più interessanti e uniche della collezione del Museo Civico, l'Ukiyo-e Geisha House di Utagawa Kunisada, con le ceramiche artistiche di Martino Cappai. Per rendere più viva questa mostra temporanea abbiamo organizzato un calendario di eventi collaterali e ci è parso subito doveroso focalizzarci in un talk sulle stampe giapponesi, in modo tale da meglio comprendere la nostra. E come ospite abbiamo deciso di guardare lontano, diciamo così, oltreoceano, e di chiedere a una delle massime esponenti nel campo, e con estremo orgoglio e incredibile piacere siamo qui con lei. Sto parlando di Sarah Thompson, curatrice della sezione arte giapponese presso il Museum of Fine Arts di Boston. Dobbiamo onestamente dire che quando gli abbiamo inviato la prima email descrivendo il nostro progetto e proponendole questo incontro, non ci aspettavamo sicuramente una risposta, e invece è stata subito entusiasta, e devo dire che ha stupito la semplicità e l'umiltà anche con la quale ha accettato il nostro invito, pur sapendo che siamo una piccola realtà, ovviamente, non come quella del museo in cui lei appunto è una delle curatrici. Considerata l'internazionalità dell'evento, il talk sarà in inglese. Al termine dell'intervento dell'ospite ci sarà la possibilità di fare delle domande e di commentare, anche chiedendo il supporto del team del MuA. Quindi, come sempre, avrete la possibilità di fare le domande, di scrivercele via WhatsApp al numero di telefono che poi vedrete in sovraimpressione, oppure di scrivere direttamente commentando l'immagine che state, il video che state vedendo. Per le persone che invece sono qua presenti, perché oggi il nostro talk è in parte online e in parte fortunatamente in presenza, avranno la possibilità di chiedercele direttamente qua o fare di persona poi le domande alla nostra ospite. A dialogare con noi stasera ci sarà anche la storica dell'arte Valentina Pini, che appunto si laurea con una tesi di dottorato in xilografia. Questo evento sarà disponibile poi successivamente sul canale YouTube del MuA Sinnai e sarà nostra premura caricarlo con i sottotitoli in italiano. Dopo una breve introduzione in inglese che mi avvio a fare, passeremo poi la parola all'ospite che ci parlerà quindi di Utagawa Kunisada e delle stampe giapponesi. Good evening and welcome from the virtual space of MuA Sinnai, Museo e Archivio, for this new appointment with talks, dialogues about art, archaeology and architecture. Last week we opened the temporary exhibition Katachi, The Shape of Things, a dialogue between one of the most peculiar and unique works in the Cesare Perra collection, hosted by the museum, the woodcut Geisha House by Utagawa Kunisada, and the ceramic creations by Martino Cappai. For this occasion, a series of events has been organized, and we thought it was important to organize a talk focused on Japanese prints to better understand our piece of art. As a guest, we decided to aim high and go over sea, over ocean, and invite one of the most important experts on this field. And we are incredibly proud to be here with her. I'm talking about Sarah Thompson, one of the several curators of Japanese art at the Museum of Fine Arts of Boston, specializing in Japanese prints. After Harvard, where she received the A.B. in linguistics, she got the PhD in Japanese art from Columbia University and taught Japanese and Asian art history at several colleges and at the University of Oregon before moving to the MFA in 2004, where she created a digital catalog of the MFA's collection of over 50,000 Japanese prints, the largest collection outside Japan. She has curated numerous exhibitions, and she is author of 6 books on the MFA collections, with a 7th book scheduled for this October, Genji, the Prince and the Parodies, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. I'd like to underline how grateful we are that she accepted our invitation. even if we are a local and small institution. At the end of this speech, we open the event for questions and comments, so feel free to write to us here or via WhatsApp. Before letting our guest speak, I'd like to introduce the art historian Valentina Pili.
Hello to everybody.
Who join us to the second part of this talk. She studied the history of art at the University of Cagliari, in particular the German engravers between the 15th and 17th century in Augsburg. Is it right?
Augsburg.
Perfect. Okay, thanks. For her PhD research, she focused on the decorative woodcuts on the books printed by a German printer during his Venetian activity at the end of the 15th century. I hope I said it
yeah,
right. Okay.
That's right.
I think I talked enough. So it's time to welcome Sarah Thompson, that is going to talk about Utagawa Kunisada and the Japanese woodblock prints. Hi, Sarah, and welcome to MuA Sinnai.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and let's just jump right into the presentation, if that's all right.
Sure, we are ready for you.
Shall I do that? Here we go. I thought I could do it. Let's see. What do I need to do?
Exactly. Open the perfect.
Is this on?
Perfect.
All right. Good. Okay. All right.
And hear you. So thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Here we go. Well, I'm actually at home physically, but I work at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. There it is from the front. And just to tell you something about the institution, we are an encyclopedic museum collecting art potentially from all times and places. We have currently roughly about 450,000 works of art. Interestingly enough, about 100,000 of those are Japanese, so over 20% of the collection. And within the Japanese collection, we have roughly 50,000 Japanese prints. It's probably the second largest collection in the world. There is one collection in Japan that thinks they have more than we do, and I expect they're right, but they have not actually counted, and we have. It took us 6 years to count them all, but we did do it. Now, the reason that we have so much Japanese art, particularly prints, is these four interesting gentlemen. That is three eccentric Bostonians who went to Japan, lived there during the 1880s, and one eccentric Japanese who became their good friend, and he himself later came and lived in Boston for several years. So I don't have time to go into the details about these very interesting characters, but they are the ones who started the buildup of our great Japanese art collection. In the case of prints, the most important of the four is the one at the far right, William Sturgis Bigelow. Now, the other three were not very interested in prints because those were a lower class, inexpensive art of the commoners. They were much more interested in things like a very elegant painting and sculpture and ceramics. But Bigelow, who you see at the right, liked everything. He collected all forms of Japanese art. He was especially fond of prints, and out of our collection of 50,000 prints, about 30,000 of them came from him. So he collected them in Japan in the 1880s. Now, he inspired many other people. He actually was, although he was the biggest donor, we have a total of about 200 people who have given us either prints or money to buy prints. And so we have amassed a very large collection. Now, when we say Japanese prints, technically that's any kind of printed image made in Japan. So anything from these 12th century Buddhist images, which, as you can see, are stamped to repeat the image over and over, And we have contemporary works by living artists we still are actively collecting. So it includes everything. However, when people think about Japanese prints, what they usually have in mind is things like this, the color woodblock prints that were made in the 18th and 19th century. So the ones across the top are from the 18th century. The ones across the bottom are from the 19th century. They are color woodblocks printed by hand with a separate carved printing block for each of the colors. So if you want to know how many printing blocks were used for a given print, you have to count how many colors are used in it. Just a rough timeline. The school of art that made these prints is known as Ukiyo-e. That means literally pictures of the floating world. What is the floating world? It is the urban popular culture that grew up in Japan beginning in the 17th century. This is what is known as the Edo period in Japanese history, or the Tokugawa period. It was the time when Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa clan, who held the title of shogun. The Tokugawas were samurai. They were military dictators ruling in the name of a figurehead emperor. So they had their center of rule in the city known at the time as Edo, which of course is Tokyo today. And meanwhile, the emperor was in Kyoto, so technically there were two capitals, but Edo was the one where most of these woodblock prints were made. The technique for making them was so successful it continued into the Meiji period in the later part of the 19th century. So during this time, the cities became important in Japan. Many of the things that happened in Japanese society in the 17th century were similar to things that happened in Europe at around the same time. So cities became more important. A cash economy developed. We have a kind of early capitalism developing in Japan at this time. There is a great increase in the middle class, the merchant class and artisan class people in the big cities. They're not members of the elite. They're not allowed to participate in government, but they do have some disposable income. And so you see the development of this floating world, lots of fun things to do in the big city. The rate of literacy rises so that commercial book publishing becomes profitable. And then in the art field, the book publishers who were already publishing heavily illustrated books had the idea to publish the pictures by themselves. And so we have the prints starting at the end of the 17th century. Then the full color printing starts in 1765. We have a very specific date because it started with calendars. It's so good, it continues for almost 150 years. Then finally, around the beginning of the 20th century, other printing methods replace the ukiyo-e prints for just everyday pictures of, favorite actors or fashions or whatever. But the prints do continue to be done as a fine art form. Now, here is your print. It's been given the name Geisha House, although it does have another title, as we'll see in a moment. But this, again, as I said, a woodblock print, one made with one block for each color. There are multiple examples of it, of course, even though many of them have not survived. There were probably a couple of thousand of them originally. There may be a few dozen left. I don't know how many. But we have one also, which I will show you presently. This is yours. And in the lower right corner, you see the signature of the artist. He signed it Toyokuni-ga in a kind of decorative border. The border is a kind of good luck symbol, which normally is a little ring, but he stretched it out to make a shape that he could put his signature inside. So this artist is Utagawa Kunisada. That's actually an art name. And again, the family name comes first. He was a member of the Utagawa School of Artists, which is organized as if it were a family. So the pupils take the same name as their teacher. It's like a family. His real name was Sumida Shozo, but I can never remember that myself. I had to look it up every time. He was a student of an artist named Utagawa Toyokuni. And yes, the kuni in Kunisada comes from the kuni in Toyokuni. It was customary for an artist to take a name that incorporated part of his teacher's name. That wasn't always done, but it was very common. So he used the name Kunisada for much of his career. And then in 1844, he changed his name and took the name of his teacher, Toyokuni. So he's also known as Toyokuni III, although it's a little bit confusing because he did not call himself that. He called himself Toyokuni II because he did not recognize the claim of the person who had used the name before he did. So, in other words, after the first Toyokuni died, another artist took the name. Kunisada felt he was the one who really deserved it, and in 1844, he finally got it. So he can be called by either names, whether you hear Kunisada or you hear Toyokuni III, it is the same person. Now, also very important in the production of prints is the publisher. That is the person who controls everything. And by law, both the artist and the publisher had to be identified on the print itself. So I've blown up the little mark, the little thing that looks like a trademark. That's exactly what it is. It is the logo of the publisher, Izumiya Ichibei. And up above that are two seals, one round and one oval. Those are the censor seals that show that this is approved for publication. The Tokugawas were very strict. They were very well aware that printing technology might be used for improper purposes, and so whenever a print was going to be produced, the preliminary drawing had to be shown to the censors, who would stamp appropriate seals on it if they approved it, and then those were cut into the block as part of the design. So fortunately for art historians, the seals that were being used at this time actually had the date on them. So we know exactly when this print was made. It was 1856 in the first month. That's the first lunar month, so it's not January, it's probably late February. Now, it turns out that actually this print is part of a larger image. If you look at it, you might be able to guess that there are more parts of the picture at the sides. And by coincidence, we happen to have one in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. I will say, you'll notice ours has brighter colors. Yours is in basically very good condition. The colors still look really good, but they were even brighter to start with. The orangey red that you see for the signature and for parts of the clothing was originally a very bright rosy red, and there are some parts that look brown that were originally purple, but the blues and greens are still very, very vivid. Anyway, here's what the full triptych looks like, and what you have is the center sheet of the triptych. The reason that our print is so very bright is that it has never, ever been exhibited. It's been just stowed away in boxes, probably since around the time when it was made. It's a very nice print. I've considered exhibiting it, but we have so much to choose from that I've never actually put this one up. Now, there is actually a title written on the print, as it turns out, and many of the prints do have titles actually written on them. It's at the upper right, in the right sheet of the triptych, 2 leaves of brocade for Genji at his peak. This is the kind of title that is more about sounding good than about telling you what's really in the picture, but the viewers of the time would have understood who Genji is. This is a kind of indirect reference to the most famous work of classical Japanese literature. You may have heard of The Tale of Genji, which was written about 1,000 years ago by Lady Murasaki at the imperial court. It's all about a handsome prince and his love affairs with many women at the imperial court in roughly about the year 1000. However, the Genji that you see here is not the original Genji. The man, the male figure sitting at the left is actually known as Inaka Genji, which means rustic Genji. That's kind of a joke because there's not anything rustic or countrified about him, but he is a character named Mitsuuji, who is the hero of a 19th century novel. In fact, it was the best-selling popular novel of 19th century Japan, and it is a parody of the famous work of classical literature. So this is very typical of the floating world culture, that they have a rather irreverent attitude toward the classics, and they do their own versions of them. This one is a thriller as well as a romantic story. It's about a young man who, like the original Prince Genji, has affairs with many women, but he is actually the younger son of a shogun, and he is working as a kind of secret agent to uncover plots against the shogunate. So he pretends to be a playboy, but it's really all, for the sake of protecting the country, supposedly. But very long, very good, very popular story. So here you see a scene of early morning in what I think is actually probably not exactly a geisha house, but a house of courtesans. Strictly speaking, it's a brothel, but it is a very expensive one, very elegant and high class for only very wealthy male patrons. Now, the season is spring. You can tell from the cherry trees blooming in the courtyard. We're on the second floor. There's a balcony looking down into a courtyard. Again, this is at the very highest level in the pleasure quarters. It looks like a palace, and that's deliberate. So it's a very elegant place. The season is early spring. It's still cold. You can see the women are bundled up, and the man too. People are bundled up in multiple layers of clothing. And the seated woman in the center sheet, the one that you have, is bending over a little space heater. It's basically a wooden box with a metal lining. It has ashes and hot coals in it, so it's a bit cold. It's the first thing in the morning. And the men who have spent the night are being seen off by their sweethearts. In the background, you see a woman helping a man with his jacket. And then our hero is at the left. He is sitting up in bed, all bundled up because it's still cold. And the little girl kneeling in front of him has brought him a basin of water and a toothbrush. So he's just about to get ready to face the day. And that is what is going on here. It's probably not a direct illustration of a scene from the book. I think it's probably just a kind of artist's imagination of a scene set in the world of that famous novel. I'm not sure about the identity of the women. I think they are courtesans, but I'm a little bit uncertain because they're not wearing the standard costume. That would be more like what you see below, with many, many hairpins, and the obi, the sash, would be tied in front. That is what you expect from the women who we call, euphemistically, we call courtesans. Frankly, they are actually sex workers or prostitutes, but at such a high level. It's thousands of dollars a night for a night with one of these women, and furthermore, they have the right to refuse a client that they don't like. So the man has to be very charming as well as very rich. The print below is also by Kunisada, although it's much older. It's from 40 years earlier, when he was a young artist just starting out. And you can see he's already very good at drawing the beautiful figures, but not nearly so good as he later became in terms of the composition. And his perspective is pretty shaky in the lower one, but you can see 40 years later, in this one, he really has it down. So there is a distinction between a technical distinction, although it is technical, between geisha and the women I'm calling courtesans, the very high ranking, they would be yujo in Japanese, the ones who wear the hairpins and the special way of tying the obi in the front. Geisha were not allowed to wear that costume. They had to dress like ordinary women. Now, the women in the print above are not wearing the costume either, but it is first thing in the morning. I think they're just not completely dressed in their usual outfits yet. So that's what's going on. Now, what's the difference? Again, the courtesan, yes, she is the one that the man actually pays to go to bed with. Geisha is something different. She is an entertainer who does music, dance, comedy, and she comes in and entertains at parties, usually parties that are held in the pleasure quarter. So, for example, in the lower print, if you look at the center sheet, in the background, you can just barely see into a room where a party is going on. So geisha comes in and entertains a party, and sex is not part of her job description. She does music and dance and comedy, and then theoretically she goes home afterward, and the courtesan is the one that the man stays with after that. Now, it is a technicality because actually, probably the geisha is romantically involved with her clients also. And if not exactly paying her directly, they are certainly giving her a nice, expensive presents in return. But that is her private life, and it's not part of the job description. So that is the technical distinction. This, by the way, is the cover of the upcoming book, which has lots of Inaka Genji pictures in it, and also pictures of the original tale of Genji, such as the one that you see on the left. So this is expected to be out in October. Now, before I talk more about Inaka Genji, I want to discuss how the prints were made. The artist Kunisada was hugely prolific. He was the most prolific, the most financially successful of all ukiyo-e artists, and he did at least about 20,000 designs during his lifetime, possibly as many as 35,000. People are still debating this, and we won't know until we get everything known by him cataloged. This is why there are very few catalogs raisonné for Japanese print artists, because the numbers are huge. The reason the numbers are so large is that all the artist does is draw the design. They do not do the physical printmaking process themselves. So the artist draws the design, it then goes to a block cutter, who uses it as a pattern to carve the blocks. As I mentioned, one for each color. The blocks go to a printer, who inks them and does the printing all by hand. No printing press was used. And it's all controlled by the publisher. The publisher is the really important one. He hires everyone else. They're basically doing a piecework for him, and then he sells the products in a bookstore. It's closely connected to book publishing. And you see an example of a bookstore there with stacks of prints and also books for sale to the general public. The process is still being done today. This is the Adachi Institute of Woodcut Prints in Tokyo. You can go to their website and see things like videos of how it's done. They do reproductions of old prints, and occasionally a contemporary artist will ask to have their work reproduced in this way, made into multiple prints. So sometimes it's done, but mostly what they do is reproductions. And there you see a block cutter at work. So the artist's drawing, or in the case of a modern reproduction, something like a photographic reproduction of an old print, but the drawing is glued to the cherry wood block face down. The paper is very thin, so when it's wet, you probably can see through it. If necessary, the block cutter will carefully rub away some of the fibers of paper from the back until he can clearly see the ink design. And then he uses that as a pattern and actually cuts right through the drawing to make the printing block. So insofar as there was ever an original drawing, it's destroyed in the process, and each and every one of the prints is considered to be an original work, assuming that it was made from the artist's drawing during the artist's lifetime. Then on the right, you see the printer at work with the carved wooden block on a little table in front of him, face up. So he inks the block, then puts the paper down on it, and rubs with a flat pad very hard to make the impression. So that is the way that it is done. This is an example from the MFA collection, what we call a key block print, and it shows you how they were able to register the colors. It took a while actually to work out how to do this, as we'll see, but the way that they get the colors perfectly aligned are the guide marks. You'll notice the little L-shaped mark in the lower right corner, and then the straight mark up above. So this block would be in front of the printer. Actually, it would be turned sideways. Imagine it rotated 90 degrees clockwise, and then the corner of the paper goes into the L shape. The side of the paper is lined up with the straight mark. And this is how you can do the perfect registration of the different colors. So this is what's known as a key block print. This would be an impression taken from the first block to be carved with the black outlines, and then each one of these, they would make several of this, and then one of them would be used for each color in the same way that the original drawing was used. So you would mark which parts are going to be blue, and the block cutter cuts a block with just the blue parts, or you mark which parts will be red, and so on. So that was the method. Now, the Japanese did not invent this printing method, or at least not exactly. It had already been done in China over 100 years earlier. Again, remember, for full color printing with 5 or more colors, the start date in Japan is 1765. The Chinese were already doing it over a century earlier. However, at this time, during the Edo period, Japanese were not allowed to travel, so no one could go to China to study printing. And although Japan did have trade with just a few countries, including China, also Korea and the Netherlands, and that was pretty much it. But only a few people were allowed into Japan, and as it happens, none of them were printers. The Japanese found out about these beautiful Chinese art books. Some of them were imported to Japan as luxury goods. They knew that color printing was possible, and they basically reverse engineered it, figured out gradually how to do it themselves. And of course, there was also color printing going on, experiments with color printing in Europe, but as far as I can tell, the Japanese did not find out about that until much later. So here is the rough timeline, just basics of Japanese history. There actually was a period of about a century when Japan was in close contact with Europe, from the 1540s to the 1630s. However, after the Tokugawa family took over, basically in order to ensure that they kept very tight control of Japan, they banned contact with all of the European countries, with one exception. They allowed the Dutch to go on trading, but they could only go to the city of Nagasaki. So it was very, very tight control. That lasted for over 200 years, from the 1630s to the 1850s. Finally, beginning in the 1850s, they did start to trade with the rest of the world again. The city of Yokohama opened as a port in 1860. Then in 1868, the new government took over and began the program of very rapid modernization to bring Japan up to the same level as the most technologically developed countries. But the period we're interested in is that time from the 1630s to the 1850s, when Japan is mostly cut off and developing its own culture. Now, the art of the floating world, Ukiyo-e, includes not only woodblock prints, but also paintings, such as these very beautiful folding screens. Again, these are large pieces of furniture used as room dividers, roughly about 6 feet tall. And these are attributed to the artist Moronobu, who is the first Ukiyo-e artist whose name is known, one of the first people to work in what at the time was a new style, showing that popular culture of the time. And here he shows the two most important institutions of the floating world, the Kabuki Theater at the top and the Yoshiwara, the pleasure quarter, below. Now, we've already talked about the Yoshiwara and the things that went on there. There were similar, that was the one that was in Edo. There were similar places in the other major cities. Prostitution was legal as long as it was done according to the regulations in the correct place. It was very hierarchical from a very high level to a relatively low level. And then there was also illegal activity going on in other places. But this was what was acceptable. And the top courtesans were like pop stars. They were the fashion setters. They were not quite respectable, but very, very glamorous. And so you see lots of them in prints. The Kabuki Theater also was a very important subject. Ironically, it was actually founded by a woman at around the beginning of the 17th century, and women were acting publicly for about the first half of the century. However, the government clamped down on that. They decided it was improper for women to appear on stage in public, and so by the end of the 17th century, Kabuki is entirely male. Again, this is similar to the staging of Shakespeare's plays, for example, where all the actors are male, and that was also the case in the Kabuki Theater. And those continued to be the top subjects for ukiyo-e prints. So once again, it's paintings, book illustrations, and single sheet prints. All of these things are ukiyo-e. And here you see some book pages and then a single sheet print by the artist Moronobu. The book illustrations come out of a traditional Japanese painting style where the shapes are outlined and then colored in. And that translated very nicely into a woodcut printing style, such as you see there. The print at the lower right, that's actually one from a series of explicit erotic prints, although this was the first print in the series, and so it was not explicit. You imagine it on the top of the stack. A young man with a woman who is probably a courtesan. And they are just sort of cuddling at that point, but then it goes on to other activities for the other 11 prints in the series. That was completely legal at the time. It wasn't until the 1720s that they began to put in stricter censorship regulations and made the erotic prints illegal. Now, these were very commercial, and so, of course, each publisher wanted the prints in his bookstore to be more eye-catching than the next guy's. So they took the original black and white prints and began to add hand coloring. Here are some from the very beginning of the 18th century. A lovely courtesan with the very elaborate costume and the obi tied in the front. She doesn't yet have the multiple hairpins. That was a style that came in later. And then on the right, you see a handsome young kabuki actor doing a dance. He wears that purple scarf over the head, which is a style often used by kabuki actors, especially those who played female roles. Here he's playing a handsome young man, but I expect that actor also plays female roles, doing a spear dance, which was a big hit at the time. And again, these are hand-colored prints featuring that orangey red lead color. A more elaborate type of coloring developed from the late 1710s. And here you see 3 examples. These are all scenes from kabuki plays, and we know what the exact dates were because the plays have been identified, although I have to admit we still have many prints in the collection that we can't date exactly because we have not figured out yet which play they represent. Then, beginning in the 1740s, the Japanese started experimenting with color printing. They were trying to figure out how the Chinese had done it and gradually working up to it. The early examples have usually two colors in addition to the black outline. So there you see the reddish pink and the green on the left. Once again, we know what plays these were made for. That's why we can date them. There's no date on the print itself. Then moving into the 1760s, they typically were using three colors, usually red, yellow, and blue, and then overlapping them to get other color effects so that olive green on the tree is actually the yellow and blue overlapped. There's some purple on the costume that is the red and blue overlapped. The breakthrough, 1765, and as I mentioned before, we have such a precise date because some of the earliest prints done in 5 or more colors were calendars for that year. So they must have been made either early in 1765 or possibly at the very end of 1764. The artist was Harunobu. And actually, if it's a full color print, such as the one on the right, we can give it a very exact date because the process started being done on a large scale in 1765, and unfortunately he died in 1770. So the print on the right is definitely within that 5-year range. Many very beautiful colors. Not all of the women that we see in the prints are courtesans. There are many different kinds of women. This is a nice young lady from an upper class family. She is showing off her cultural skills. She plays the koto. In the background, you see a tea kettle suggesting the tea ceremony, and there's also equipment for incense connoisseurship on the shelf. So a very elegant young lady. Now, to be sure, she is the kind of young lady that a top-level courtesan would try to look like, but this is not a courtesan herself. And on the left, I think that the reason Harunobu was selected to design the new color prints was that he was so good at using the limited colors, as we see on the left. Very nice example. This is actually what's called a warrior print. It is a historical scene from Japanese history of a samurai writing a message on a tree. But very beautifully printed, and you can hardly believe there were only 3 color blocks. He was so good at that I think that's why they chose him to design the full color prints. Moving into the 1780s, at this time, a different type of figure develops, very long, elongated, very elegant figures. They look rather like fashion drawings, very good for showing off the gorgeous kimono. That's a group of courtesans in the top piece under the cherry trees. And then in the lower one, it is not courtesans, but affluent middle-class women on a pilgrimage to a sacred island that is not far from the city of Edo. So it was a very popular place to go, especially in the summer. You go and enjoy the beach, and it's actually still a very popular beach resort. And you can see Mount Fuji from there, or at least you could in the old days. And you'll notice these are triptychs. This was commonly done to make a bigger picture for the sake of efficiency. You saw how the printer worked, and one standard sheet of paper, which is roughly about twice the size of a sheet of computer printer paper. So that standard size is just about what it is easy for one person to do by hand. If you try to make a bigger print with one person doing the hand printing process, then it is more difficult. The printer would probably have to shift and move around. It would be hard to do. So the most efficient way, if you want to do a bigger design, is to separate it into standard size sheets and put them together. So it's very, very common, and it develops around this time and continues to be done all through the rest of the history of Ukiyo-e prints. And you see beautiful full colors. I might add, I picked the best colors I could find. It's very unusual for the colors to have survived this well in the 18th century prints, they're almost all vegetable colors and they fade very quickly. So you really have to be very careful about the fading problem. Here are some examples from the 1790s. This is considered the golden age of Japanese prints. People really especially like these two artists, Utamaro doing beautiful women, and Sharaku doing actor prints. They have a special technique in both cases, in addition to the color printing. And these colors, by the way, are somewhat faded, but the prints are so good that you like them anyway. That is powdered mica, the silvery color. It's the mineral. You can't really grind it fine enough to print with properly. So what they did was print all the colors and everything else first, then put a paper stencil over it and paint on the silver mica. And you get a very beautiful glittering effect. Some people think it's supposed to be a mirror. I think it's just supposed to really set off the figures. So on the left, those women are Yoshiwara geisha. They're actually in a costume parade. They're dressed as street vendors. So showing off their skills at music and dance and comedy in the parade. And then the actor print, Sharaku is the most famous of all of the artists doing actor caricatures. He does these wonderful, exaggerated images that are really very modern in feeling, greatly admired. He worked, it's a pen name, he worked for less than a year. We don't know who he really was. So to this day, there are many theories about the true identity of Sharaku. The actor prints had gradually become more realistic over the course of the 18th century until finally it went through realism and came out on the other side as caricature. So Sharaku's prints are greatly exaggerated. No one has such a big nose or a big chin or small eyes, but it's very, very recognizable, and people just loved it. He was very influential on later artists. So this is from 1794. Here is one of his contemporaries. That is Toyokuni, the teacher of Kunisada. So he learned from Sharaku how to do these wonderful, exaggerated actor caricatures, and then he passes that on about 20 years later. Here we see Kunisada as the bright young man, the pupil of Toyokuni. Toyokuni made the Utagawa school, the most important school of Ukiyo-e prints, and then Kunisada took it up after his teacher died in 1825. We've already seen this early work, the other subject that Kunisada specialized in, beautiful women, especially courtesans, but also many other kinds of women as well. And these were his two specialties. After 1825, when his teacher died, he was the top artist doing these very popular subjects, and he really took the lead among the ukiyo-e artists and held it for the rest of his life. Now, of course, there were other very important artists as well. And from the 1830s, the subject matter branched out. So we move from the actors and women and begin to see other things also. Landscapes are very, very famous, and those are greatly admired today. Also, nature subjects. These are known in Japan as bird and flower prints. You do also see animals and fish and other kinds of natural subjects as well, but there's just an example. And then the so-called warrior prints, scenes from history, and sometimes from certain kinds of literature from both China and Japan. And Kuniyoshi was the most famous artist doing those. So these types of things begin to become popular, branches out. Once again, here are the two top landscape artists, Hokusai and Hiroshige, with very famous works that I'm sure you're familiar with. Until fairly recently, actually for most of the 20th century, the Western connoisseurs thought that these two artists really were the only good print designers in the 19th century. They didn't much like the 19th century figure prints. They did like the older figure prints, right up to Sharaku's actor prints, but then they were not impressed with our friends Kunisada and his colleague Kuniyoshi. However, happily that idea has changed, and they are now beginning to be suitably appreciated. Here is Kuniyoshi. He, in addition to Kunisada is the other very famous designer of figure prints. His specialty was the warrior prints, and this is actually supposedly a historical scene, but it's from a fantasy novel, showing the evil sorceress at the left summoning up the giant skeleton to attack the hero in the center. Very striking composition. And we actually had an exhibition at the MFA in 2017 comparing these two great artists. So it was Kuniyoshi versus Kunisada. Which one do you like better? And there is a warrior by Kuniyoshi at the left and a beautiful young woman by Kunisada at the right. People asked us, so who won? And the answer is, at the time, Kunisada. He was definitely number one, and he was the most popular, even though Kuniyoshi was also very popular. Today, I think Kuniyoshi is ahead because his warrior prints remind people of scenes in manga and anime. They're very very exciting, very action-filled, often with a fantasy element. But both artists are very, very good, and it was fun to compare them. They did definitely influence each other. You see in this print, Kuniyoshi is drawing a close-up of the hero, very similar to the way that Kunisada for years had been doing close-ups of actors, close-ups of beautiful women. Kunisada, for his part, is influenced by Kuniyoshi's skill in composition. He does very exciting, very colorful scenes, such as this illustration from a kabuki play. Kunisada was so popular that the publishers were willing to take risks for him. He designed this 8-sheet set, which is the tallest Ukiyo-e print that I'm aware of. I don't know of any other that is this big in height. There are some that are stretched out longer in width, but it's a tower. It's actually 4 separate diptychs. This is the top one that you see blown up at the left, and they fit together to make a tower. It does show kabuki actors, but they're not in a scene from an actual play. They are costumed as characters from a well-known fantasy novel, having this great fight on top of a tower, and then other people are arranged in the lower parts of the tower. So it's kind of an imaginary scene. It shows what it might be like if the actors were playing the parts of the characters in the novel. He does many, many gorgeous triptychs of lovely young women. Here are 3 beautifully dressed women. They might be geisha or they might be middle-class women dressed up. It's hard to tell. The way I've sometimes described a geisha is she's a woman who wears her party clothes all the time because partying is her business. But at any rate, 3 very gorgeous young women at a shrine, a Shinto shrine, in the city of Edo, which was very close to where Kunisada himself lived, and he and his students had made donations to this shrine, as you see on the hanging lanterns there. Another thing that Kunisada was very famous for was his illustrations to the book Inaka Genji, which I mentioned before, and which is the subject of your print. So here is another scene, and the hero, his name is actually Mitsuuji, is very recognizable because Kunisada invented a special hairstyle for him. To the best of my knowledge, no one wore this hairstyle in real life unless they were doing cosplay of the character from the novel. It's the so-called shrimp tail hairstyle. Now, the standard hairstyle for men in the Edo period was for adult men, was to have the front of the head shaven, and then the rest of the hair is gathered up in a top knot. But for this character, Kunisada imagined the top knot is pulled forward, kind of flipped forward over the shaven part of the head, and the very end of it is curled into two little curls like a shrimp tail. So there is the hero with his shrimp tail hairstyle. This particular color print is actually based on one of the black and white illustrations for the novel that Kunisada had drawn some years ago. So he did a number of those. Then he also did imaginary scenes. I think this is probably one of his imaginary scenes, not actually in the novel, but I'm not sure. It may be that I just haven't found it yet. If I do find it, I'll let you know. So there is the hero over at the left with his very distinctive shrimp tail hairstyle. Now, just to wind up, I will quickly tell you what happens to Kunisada and what happens to Ukiyo-e prints. Kunisada, I'm happy to say, died old and very rich. This was done, this is a portrait of him. He was working until almost the end, still designing excellent prints and being very successful at it. So this is a portrait made just the year before he died by one of his students. And it was done as the title page for a series of prints. And he was so famous that his face was actually a selling point. What happened to Ukiyo-e prints? Well, already by 1863, when Kunisada died, things were changing very drastically with Japan. And already, since 1860, Yokohama had become a treaty port. There was extensive trading going on with the Western countries. In 1868, the new government took over and set out to make Japan a modern country, while at the same time somehow keeping the characteristics that make it Japan. And interestingly enough, the woodblock prints continued to be made all through this time. They were a very efficient, affordable way of doing full color printing. And it wasn't really until the end of the 19th century that the European equivalent, which was color lithography, really became equally affordable and widespread. So here is a woodblock print made in exactly the same way as Kunisada's prints, made in 1887. Beautiful women under the cherry blossoms with Mount Fuji in the distance. But now the beautiful women are wearing the high fashion of the 1880s, and you see the cutting edge technology of the steel bridge in the background. This actually represents the lady in black, is understood to represent the Meiji Empress, and the gentleman in uniform standing up in the boat almost certainly is representing the emperor himself. So a very gorgeous example of the new version of the floating world. Now, what happened in the 20th century, as I mentioned, the Ukiyo-e prints stopped. They came to an end as illustrations of the popular culture because new things came in. From roughly about 1905, 1910 on, if you wanted a picture of your favorite actor, you bought a photograph. If you wanted to know about fashion, you bought a magazine. If you wanted to see pictures of a place you might like to visit, you would buy a book or a magazine or maybe some postcards. However, the woodblock prints did continue to be made as now explicitly art for art's sake. They were now considered an art form as they had not been before. There are two main trends. You get the old method where the artist draws the picture and other people produce it. But as you see, it's a new westernized style. Very beautiful prints. And then you also get the creative prints, the Sosakuhanga, which were done in the same way that 20th century Western artists did. The artist does everything, does the carving, not just drawing, but carving and printing also. Woodblock did continue to be the main medium used for printmaking in Japan. There were, of course, some artists experimenting with other media, but this was the main one until until the 1970s. At that point, it branched out, and artists today, there are many people doing prints and using many different technologies. I showed you this as an example of a 21st century print, and this one is done in silkscreen. So the prints are still very much being made in Japan, and we are definitely still collecting them. So thank you, and please let me know if you have questions. Okay. Click to exit. Okay. All right.
Okay.
I'm afraid that took a little long, but
no, it was perfect actually. Thank you so much. It was an incredible speech, and I think it has been full of information. And it's incredibly fascinating how a debate and also a comparison between two different institutions like ours can improve the knowledge about a piece of art. In this case, well, in our case, the Ukiyo-e, which was in a way underestimated for a long time. And because I think there were not enough, there was not enough information to appreciate it, and I think this was the occasion to actually understand how important is this piece of art that we have in our collection. So thank you so much. It was incredibly interesting. I'm asking now Valentina if you want to say anything.
Yes, thank you. Sarah, I want to thank you very, very much because we've seen that ukiyo-e are quite different from our culture, our Western works of art. And you have led us really in another world. So thank you. I wanted to ask something, if I can.
sure.
So, I've seen that a characteristic of ukiyo-e is a well-defined line which depict the figures in the scene. Quite different from our chiaroscuro woodcuts, so with more blended colors. Are there something in Japan similar to our chiaroscuro woodcuts?
Yeah. Not very close. There are some experiments already in 18th century prints, and I'm sorry I don't have any pictures to show you. Some artists did try experimenting with just color without the black outlines. There are a few examples of that, but only a few. Now, in terms of so that's probably there's nothing quite like the European prints. There is also you can and you see this in the landscapes. You can sometimes get a little bit of shading by a printing technique where you when you put the color on the block, if you wet the block, then you can let it bleed a little bit. And so you can sometimes get a bit of shading or a blended look by doing that. But that's not really the same thing as having the different colors printed without the outline. So yeah, that's a very good point. And there, I guess the answer is yes, but only a few exceptions.
And these examples are always of the 17th, 18th century or more young?
Oh, well, of course, once you get into the 20th century, then Japan is very much part of the world. You know, the Japanese artists are very much in touch with the rest of the world and know what's going on. And so really anything that is happening anywhere else is probably happening in Japan too. You know, you have basically the same global art movements, and you can find all kinds of things at that point. So I'm really just talking only about the more traditional things from say before 1912.
Thank you.
Do you have
Thank
any
you.
other question, Valentina? Okay, I'm going to ask to the audience if they have any question. Do they have?
Yes, I would like to know. I don't know if
Come
yes,
here. You can come here, so you can ask from here because the mic is too far from you.
Good evening. Maybe for you is good morning. I would like to know what kind of pigment they have used.
Yes, yeah. That's an excellent question. There have been a lot of studies, and there still is a lot of work still to be done. In the very early hand-colored prints, there are just a few things that can specifically be identified. So the very early ones have the red lead. Interestingly enough, it's a color that was used a lot in European illuminated manuscripts. It's minium. It's the same thing. But most of the colors that were used were vegetable colors. And as I said, there's a huge problem with fading. They fade very rapidly. So mostly vegetable colors. And then there's a very important change that happens in the late 1820s, and that actually was probably a factor in why landscapes became so important at that time. That is that the Japanese began to use Prussian blue. The European synthetic pigment, it was actually, they called it Berlin blue, which tells you where it came from. But that was imported through the Dutch traders. The Japanese actually had it for a long time, but it had been very expensive at first. It was invented, I believe, in the early 18th century, was one of the first synthetic colors. It's that gorgeous dark blue that makes something like the Great Wave print possible. But the price went down. And apparently what happened in Japan, the reason it became cheap enough to use in inexpensive woodblock prints, and the prints were inexpensive, relatively speaking, apparently the Chinese started bringing it to Japan as well as the Dutch. The Dutch had sold it rather expensively. The Chinese sold it more cheaply, and the price went down enough that the Japanese started using it in prints for the first time in the late 1820s. 1828 is first documented use, and then Hokusai produces his 36 Views of Mount Fuji, which is the first best-selling landscape series starting in about 1830, and making extensive use of that gorgeous blue color. In fact, the very earliest designs seem to have been printed entirely in shades of blue. Then for things like the Wave, he put in just a little bit of other colors, but still mainly blue. Then there's another big change when you get into the Meiji period, because then, of course, they have full contact with the rest of the world, and it's also when synthetic dyes are developing in Europe. So they start using aniline dyes. There's a very, very bright red that is an aniline dye, also a purple that you see very often in the late 19th century prints in the Meiji era. So it's a huge question, and there are lots of interesting answers. If you poke around online, you probably can find some articles about it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Martina, would you like to ask anything? Okay. I think we have a question, okay, online. Can you please send it? Okay, we have Ilenia. What would you like to ask?
Hello, and thank you, Sarah, for being here. Well, actually, I have two questions about women, because you mentioned women as
Yes.
subjects. So my curiosity is, were women just subjects of the ukiyo-e, and they weren't artists, or maybe their names were lost when Japan exported their art to the Western cultures? And another question is, did women were women allowed to sign their own ukiyo-e, or were they forced, let's say, to use some pseudonyms or other art names, for example?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
It's a very interesting issue. there are a few known female artists, not very many. The most famous one is Hokusai's daughter. She was also an artist who did sign with her own art name. Now, again, remember, all of the artists are using pseudonyms, and the pseudonyms are not necessarily gendered, so we may not know for sure whether an art, unless we know more about them, we don't necessarily know if they were male or female. Some of the female artists, especially if they were amateurs, will put the character for woman at the end of the name, so we know it was, Ms. So-and-so. But the professionals would be using the same kinds of art names as the men. In terms of whether, yes, almost certainly women were involved in things like block cutting and printing and so on, but as you suggested, we just don't know. The names aren't recorded. Most businesses, printmaking, like other businesses in Japan, was very much a family business. So everyone would pitch in. And I'm sure there were women helping out, but we don't hear about it officially. Other than that, well, another thing that is kind of relevant that you didn't mention is the question of women as consumers. In all those prints of courtesans, I think one reason they sold so well was that, men bought them as pinups and women bought them as fashion plates. So that may have been part of it. And definitely, we probably should not overlook women as consumers and patrons actually buying the art. And that we imagine that all these paintings of women were made for men. Not necessarily, or not entirely. So that's an aspect too. So yeah, a lot of interesting places. Very, very frustrating, because some of these things we may never know the answer to. And actually, recently, the Museum of Fine Arts has been trying to identify female artists. And it's very frustrating for us because often we just don't know. So it's an ongoing question.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay. Elena, do you have any other question?
No, I don't. Thank you, Isa.
Okay, thank you so much. I don't know if we have any other question from the audience. No? Okay. Okay, Vale, it's okay. Okay. So thank you so much, Sarah, for this speech. Actually, and for this incredible. Tell me. Sure.
Yeah.
And thank you, Valentina, as well, and all people that actually were here. I'd like to say that this event will be downloaded on MuA YouTube channel, so you will be able to see again, to watch again this video on demand on YouTube as soon as we upload it. Okay, thank you so much, and I'm going to.
Thank you.
Grazie. I switch for the final greetings in Italian, and but I want to finish saying, Sarah, that we are incredibly proud that you decided to stay with us today. So again, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Vale, vuoi dire qualcosa?
No, sì, vorrei veramente ringraziare Sara per la presenza, la sua presenza qui al MuA, veramente siamo onorati, è stato un discorso veramente interessante, quindi andrò anche a rivedermelo più con calma. Thank you Sarah, very very much, thank you.
Giusto, ci tengo poi a ricordare che questo evento sarà di nuovo appunto caricato sul canale YouTube, come abbiamo detto, e sarà nostra premura poi a creare dei sottotitoli in italiano in modo tale che poi tutti abbiano la possibilità di comprendere l'importanza di questo incontro. Ci tengo a dire che incontri di questo tipo non sono diciamo all'ordine del giorno, ma ripeto, è stato incredibilmente semplice farlo e non ce lo aspettavamo. Questo è veramente molto importante, perché appunto a volte andare oltreoceano risulta quasi a volte più semplice, ecco. Quindi devo dire che la possibilità di essere online ci ha portato veramente lontano e anzi ci ha avvicinato tantissimo a una realtà come quella della Museum of Fine Arts di Boston. Quindi grazie ancora a Sarah Thompson, grazie tantissime a Valentina Pili che ha deciso di essere qui con noi, e grazie a tutti voi che ci avete seguito. Vi invitiamo ovviamente a venire a visitare la mostra Katachi, la forma delle cose, che sarà visitabile fino al 18 luglio. Vi ricordiamo giusto gli ultimi, i prossimi appuntamenti, partendo da quello di domani: degustazione del tè con 2 sommelier del tè, una accreditata come Katachi sommelier e l'altra invece che sta ultimando i suoi studi come sommelier del tè esclusivamente giapponese, a partire dalle ore 17:30. Successivamente vi aspettiamo domenica per l'evento musica e arte, accompagnati dai musicisti della scuola civica di San Sperate, e poi prossimi eventi che saranno pubblicati a breve, sempre collegati a questa mostra temporanea. Ringraziamo anche Martino Cappai che è qua presente e oggi è stato ospite, insomma, nostro, ma come abbiamo già detto le sue ceramiche sono parte integrante di questa mostra e di questo progetto. Grazie ancora e alla prossima, buona serata.